Alright, welcome to today's lesson on files. Today we're going to look at how to both input from a file and output to a file in Java. So far, all the programs we've done so far have used the keyboard to get our information from the user. This is great if we have information that we're getting at the time, but if the user wants to store information in a file, we have to know how to get it from there as well. Incidentally, we can only do this when we're creating code in applications. We cannot use files in applets in an online environment. So if we want to make sure we're using a file, we have to remember to do two particular things. The first is that we have to import the java.io package. And just like the HSA console package and the java.util package, this contains codes written by other programmers that we can use in our program. Specifically, it's going to contain the bufferedreader and other input-output classes that we discussed today for us to use. The second thing we have to do is at the end of the main method's header, we have to add the line throws IO exception. This is a specific code that tells Java that we're going to work with files, and if a file doesn't exist or has some problem opening, it's going to throw out an error message that we can then analyze later. Okay? When we're actually starting to work with files, before we can do that, we have to connect to that file. We have to tell our program where on our hard drive that file exists. We do that using what's called a bufferedreader object, which also itself uses a file reader object. So in order to make a bufferedreader object, we have to use an input stream through the file reader, and that's done in these two lines of code here. So I declare my bufferedreader called input, and then I'm going to construct it. I'm going to say input is going to be a new bufferedreader. The bufferedreader constructor requires the use of a file reader object, so I'm going to make a new file reader object. And in turn, the file reader is going to require a file name. This file name must be a string. So I have to provide a string here to be given to open up a file reader, which is going to allow me to make a bufferedreader, which is allowing me to connect to my file so that I can input from it. Let's see what that looks like in an example program. So here's my code. You notice that I've imported the java.io, and I've said I'm going to throw an IO exception in my main method. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create my bufferedreader object called input. And then as we saw in that example in the lesson, I'm going to input new bufferedreader, which is going to make a new file reader, which is going to open the file which I have called input_testfile.txt. This file is stored in the same location as the .java file or .class file that I'm working with here. And then once I've created that link to that file, all I have to do is use the readline or readint codes just like I would when working with the console class. But instead of opening from the console, I'm going to get it from my bufferedreader. This program specifically is going to go line by line, reading all the lines one at a time, getting an integer value, counting the number of integers that I get, getting the sum of all those integers so that I can calculate the average. So the file that I've made, input test file, contains the numbers 10, 20, 30, and 40. If I calculate the average of those, I should get the answer of 25. So let's run it and see what we get. There you go. So it gets it from the file, calculates the numbers, answer of 25, and we're done. So if I want to take a look at how to do output to a file, it's very much the same way. Except instead of using bufferedreader and file reader, I'm going to use printwriter. And to output to a text file, I'm going to use the exact same things we used in the console class, the print and printline methods. When I've finished the file, the program will automatically put a null string at the end so that if I'm going to open the file later and read it, I can find where the end of my file exists. If I want to make sure I'm opening that file again at a later point in time, I have to make sure I close the file so that I can put that null string at the end of it before I actually end my program itself. Otherwise, the file won't be stored properly and I will not be able to access it properly. At the end of execution of a program, all files are automatically closed. So if I don't need to use that file again within the program itself, I don't have to close it, although it is still good practice to do so. And once again, when you're going to try to output to a file, you have to have the import statements and the throws IO exception statements that we saw earlier. So let's take a look at an example of doing output. So here's an example where I'm going to create a bufferedreader, which is going to input data from a file that I've called poem.txt. That file has a little poem in here that you may recognize. Okay, it's just 4 lines of text. And it's going to output data to a second file that I'm going to call poem2.txt that doesn't exist yet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get 1 line of text, and then I'm going to allow myself to put a number in front of that line of text and output it. Just like you would see in a Shakespeare play, and I have each of my lines of text numbered. When I'm finished, I close my output file so I could open it later. So let's run it and see what happens here. Okay, so this is just telling me that I got some code, something's been done. Let's open poem 2, and there we have that same poem we had before with numbers written in front of it. That's it. I hope you learned something today, and we'll see you tomorrow in class where we can practice what we've learned.